We've heard about supply chain issues, but you take it a step further here and argue that maybe we're too dependent on other countries, too dependent on globalization. Are you saying we need to completely rethink supply chains?
Well, I'm saying we need to rethink more than that, actually. For the last half century, we've had a process of what I would call neoliberal globalization, which is, about the idea that capital goods people can move wherever they want and that they're always going to land wherever it's most productive. And that worked really well for capital. And the biggest beneficiaries have been multinational companies and the Chinese state. It's the cheap capital for cheap labor bargain between the US and Asia. But now that is just fundamentally shifting. And it's been happening for a while, but I think the pandemic and war in Ukraine were really almost like a scrim that was pulled up. And suddenly people thought, oh, maybe it's not a good idea to get our energy from an autocrat. Or, gosh, maybe it's not such a safe thing if 92% of the high-end chips in the world are produced in one island that's, maybe going to be blockaded or even taken over by China. So I think that these are things that are now in the felt experience of most people. But even before the decoupling that was about geopolitics, which we all know is happening, there was a lot of regionalization and even localization happening in supply chains for all kinds of reasons. One of which is wages had risen in Asia. That whole arbitrage between productivity, wages, energy costs was changing. A lot of companies were starting to say, oh, the low margin stuff, we don't really want to tote it a long way through the South China Seas. Maybe we'll do it regionally. Now, I think with ESG concerns, with energy prices, with the Europe, China, and the US in different ways, but all kind of pushing in the same direction towards, if not a price on carbon, at least some sort of accountability for carbon, those long supply chains will become even harder. And then finally, we've got one more really important tailwind, which is high-tech manufacturing. I mean, we are about to see, I believe, what we saw when the iPhone came out in the consumer space, just that boom in the app economy and all kinds of growth. That's now coming into the industrial space through decentralized technologies like 3D printing or vertical farming. I mean, we are really about to go through a massive technological change that's just going to make it a lot more efficient and resilient to hub production and consumption more closely together.
Is more localization, or the pendulum swinging back that way, though, could that also be seen as a step backwards? Is there a healthy middle?
Well, for sure, there is a healthy middle. I'm so glad you said that, because oftentimes when you have the globalization debate, on the one hand, you've got people that say we got to go back to the 90s. And then on the other hand, you say, oh my gosh, if we don't go back to the 90s, it's going to be the 1930s. No, we're in a whole new era. I think economic pendulums always swing throughout history. That's true. You go back to 18th century mercantilism that worked until it didn't, and then you got laissez-faire, and then you got Keynesianism, and then we've had now a half century or so of neoliberalism, most recently in the form of the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, which maybe with the collapse of Liz Truss's government and the disaster that is Trussonomics, we may see this as the apex and the kind of end of that old era before we move into something new.
How do you see the relationship between the U.S. and China evolving, especially with the actions that the Biden administration has taken on chips and what we heard from Xi Jinping over the weekend?
Yeah, for sure. So the U.S. is reacting basically to China. I mean, as we all know, China is always very clear about its 5-year plans. It lays them out. They're available for people to read. Xi is, adds another layer of complexity. The nationalism, the populism that's gone along with him is a little bit off-piste for China, which tends to produce more sort of middle-of-the-road technocratic leaders. But I think that it's been clear for some time that China wants to decouple from U.S. technology. It wants to have what it calls a dual circulation economy, which essentially means the same thing: regionalism, hubbing production and consumption. They've got enough rich consumers now. They want to keep some of their, their factory production at home. They don't want to be the factory of the world anymore. They also want to become less coupled with the dollar, which is a whole nother part of this. I mean, what we've seen so far is shifts in supply chains and trade. What we may now start seeing is shifts in the financial markets as China tries to do more digital RMB business. You see the weaponization of the dollar with sanctions. So there's decoupling in financial markets too.
Before we go, I have to get your quick thoughts on Liz Truss resigning today. Obviously a fierce neoliberal advocate, which in the end certainly didn't work out so well. Are we witnessing a major ideological shift here?
It's hard to look at what's happened. Liz Truss comes in and says, hey, we've got a growth problem. Let's cut taxes on the very wealthiest, even as we spend on energy subsidies. And wow, the markets didn't like that. We've had about 20 years, I would say, in this country and in the Anglo-American world in general, where it's been pretty clear that trickle down wasn't working until the recent bout of inflation. And there are other reasons for that. Wages for most Americans have been flat since the last 20 years. The same has been true in the UK. Cutting taxes on the rich is not the solution. The Reagan-Thatcher era is over. We don't have a sort of post-game strategy yet completely, but we have some ideas about where to go, and trickle down is not it.
So, look, where do you see the world going? Like 5 years from now, how much more localized will the economy be? Will the economy be in better shape? I mean, we're about to go through what could potentially be a 2 to 3 year downturn.
Yes. So let me raise one issue first, and I'll kind of put the caveat to my own thesis, which is inflation. We're moving towards a world of more redundancy of supply, more resiliency of supply, and that's inflationary, right? Cheap is not cheap. People are going to have to pay more for stuff. That's an issue. Are they going to want to do that? And then are we going to go back, kind of be pushed back into the old model? I don't think so, because I think that geopolitics have fundamentally changed. You just could look in the last 48, 72 hours what Biden has done with dual-use chip technology exports. That's changed the semiconductor supply chain overnight. I think we're going to see a lot more localization for all kinds of reasons. And ultimately, after what may be a bumpy 5 years or so, I think we're going to come back into a better place in this country, because making things has always been important. Everybody that has ever spent time in a factory floor, and I did, I grew up in them, my dad ran factories, kind of knows that that's an important part of innovation and iteration. So I think having an economy that's based on something aside from finance and software and is more diverse and inclusive in this country is going to be a good thing.